Unless you've been living under a rock, you will have heard that the original committee of Septuagint translators translated only the 5 books of Moses. This is a claim that I would like to challenge today by going back to the original Jewish sources, the New Testament, and early Christian witnesses to the history of the Septuagint. We'll be looking at the quotations, we'll be looking at the Greek, and going deep into this question. If you find the Septuagint interesting, please hit that subscribe button because I do original research on the Septuagint and the Bible, and this is information you are not going to find anywhere else, I promise you. Without any further ado, let's get right into the content. So many scholars believe that the Septuagint was a translation of only the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, or sometimes called the Torah. This includes big names in Septuagint scholarship like Alfred Ralphs, Henry Sweet, Edmund Gallagher, and Peter Williams, and so many more. This is, I believe, the overwhelming consensus of current scholars. Now, most simply present this view as a matter of fact without providing any justification.
Only the 5 books of Moses were originally translated by the some 70 or 72 rabbis. We have, incidentally, numerous sources for the Septuagint. This is not controversial.
But there are nuances and difficulties this view raises, especially for Christians. Now, this video's purpose is to simply provide transparency and put forward facts that scholars very rarely point out. And I just want you to know all the facts. That's what this is. So some of the pieces to the puzzle of figuring out the Septuagint don't fit with this neat little narrative that the original Septuagint was only the 5 books of Moses. Now, what arguments do scholars have for this view? Why did they believe that only the first 5 books of Moses were translated by the 70? Well, all the early Jewish sources say that the Law was translated by the 70. Now, this law is interpreted in the context of a tripartite division of the Old Testament. So the tripartite division is to take the Old Testament and to separate the books into 3 groups: the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. So when people are reading these ancient Jewish sources and it says that the Law was translated, they're applying the context of the tripartite division, saying that, okay, this law must refer only to the books of Moses. Josephus reports that not all Jewish records were translated, but only the books of the law. Okay, again, similar language like the other Jewish resources. In his preface to his book Antiquities, he says, "For even if he," that's Ptolemy, "failed to obtain all our records, it was only the portion containing the law which he translated." Okay, so this is interpreted by St. Jerome to be only the Pentateuch. He says in his preface to the Book of Hebrew Questions, "Add to this that Josephus, who gives the story of the 70 translators, reports them as translating only the 5 books of Moses, and we also acknowledge that these are more in harmony with the Hebrew than the rest." Scholars also look at Philo, and he's writing a book called On the Life of Moses, and he's talking about Mosaic legislation, Mosaic laws, and he sets the context for the Septuagint as the Mosaic law, and he says, "Ptolemy then, being sovereign of this character, and having conceived a great admiration for and love of the legislation of Moses, conceived the idea of having our laws translated into the Greek language." So scholars are looking at this and saying, well, it kind of sounds like these laws are the legislation of Moses. We also have the Talmud, which records the history of the Septuagint, and it says very explicitly, "Write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher," and talking about that within the context of the history of the Septuagint being translated. There's also internal evidence when scholars are looking at the quality of the translations, the word choices. They're seeing a diversity of translation styles within the Septuagint text, and they're saying, well, there's obviously different people who are translating these books, so it probably wasn't one committee that was producing it. So these are some of the main arguments that scholars are going to give of evidence in favor of the Pentateuch alone view. Now, it's my value that you should be aware of all the evidence. Okay, so I'm just trying to level set here. I'm trying to present everything forward so for your own analysis. I think if you have all the information, you can come to your own conclusion. So you should know that this is not the only interpretation that exists. It's not an exclusive interpretation of the Jewish text that only the Pentateuch was translated. There have been, and still are, different interpretations of what the law consisted of and was comprised of in those ancient Jewish sources. And there is actually evidence to the contrary of this view. It actually contradicts this view, which I'm going to be presenting in this video. And again, you won't find this anywhere else. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. You should know all the facts and come to your own conclusion, okay? So don't shoot me. I'm just the messenger. I'm just going to be presenting evidence that I think goes against this view for your own consideration. So let's get right into it. So what do the early Jewish sources actually say about what the Septuagint translators translated? Well, in all of our earliest Jewish sources, that's the Letter of Aristeas, Aristobulus, Philo, and Josephus, they all say that the law was translated by the Judean translators. However, they never defined law as only the books of Moses. This is very, very important. So even though they say the law was translated, they never say that this law was just the books of Moses. They never appeal to that tripartite division of the Old Testament. That has to be interpreted into the text. You have to interpret the law as the books of Moses. So here's an example from the Letter of Aristeas. It says, I have determined that your law shall be translated from the Hebrew tongue, which is in use amongst you, into the Greek language, that these books may be added to the other royal books in my library. So what is this law? Is it the Pentateuch? Is it the Old Testament in general? That has to be interpreted into the text because it doesn't specify exactly what the law means. So why is that important? Well, that's important because in ancient Judaism, the law or the word law could refer to the Jewish scriptures in general, and this is very well known. So in the New Testament, for example, Jesus, Paul, and the Jews all refer to the Psalms and the prophets as the law, right? So we have multiple quotes that prove this. In John 10:34, it says, Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law? I said, you are God's. And he is quoting from Psalm 82:6. So here Jesus is calling the Psalms the law. In John 15:25, it says, but this happened that that the word might be fulfilled, which was written in their law. They hated me without a cause. And this is a quote from Psalm 34:19. Again, the Psalms are called the law. In John 12:34, it says, the people answered him, that's the Jewish people, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Now, this quotation, that Christ remains forever, is probably referring to Psalm 89:35-37. Could also be referring to a passage in Isaiah or Ezekiel or Daniel, which all say something similar. Either way, this reference is not to a book in the Pentateuch. It's either a reference to the Psalms or one of the prophets. Now, this is the Jewish people themselves referring to the Psalms and the prophets as the law. Paul very explicitly in 1 Corinthians 14:21 says, in the law it is written, with men of other tongues and other lips I will speak to this people, and yet for all that they will not hear me. He is quoting from Isaiah 28:11. So here Paul is calling Isaiah the law. In Romans 3:19, Paul says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. Now, before he says this, he lists a whole cluster of quotes from Psalms and Isaiah. So again, the context here of the law is the Psalms and Isaiah. So in the New Testament, the word law is used many times to refer to the scriptures in general, especially the prophets and the Psalms. We have multiple examples here: Matthew 5:18, Luke 10:26, Luke 16:17, John 7:49. You can look them up for yourself if you're curious. But this is very common language to refer to the Old Testament in general as the law in the New Testament. Well, even in later Jewish tradition, the word law still was used for the entire Old Testament in general sometimes. We have a quotation here from Pirkei Avot, okay? Moses received the law, or the Torah, at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. Now, obviously, more than the 5 books of Moses were passed on from Joshua and the elders and the prophets and to the assembly. There's more books in that Torah that was passed on. So, obviously, here in mind, Torah is referencing the Jewish scriptures in general. So in ancient Judaism, the law could refer to the Jewish scriptures in general, especially to the prophets and the Psalms. And this is very well known. The BDAG entry for nomos, which is the Greek word for law, says in the wider sense, nomos equals Holy Scripture generally, on the principle that the most authoritative part gives name to the whole. In the Net Bible, there's a footnote which says law could, in common usage, refer to the entire Old Testament. So just because the earliest Jewish sources say that the law was translated by the 70 translators or by the Judean translators who produced the Septuagint, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was only the Pentateuch that they were translating, okay? That has to be interpreted into those sources because they never define the law as the 5 books of Moses. So it's very important just to go back to those original sources, take a look at what is it actually saying. Well, it says the law was translated. It doesn't say that the 5 books of Moses were translated. And we know that in ancient Judaism, law could refer to the Pentateuch, but it also could refer to the Old Testament in general. And we see that in multiple instances in the New Testament. So let's take a look at some of these ancient Jewish sources and analyze some of their own words. So Aristobulus provides probably our earliest account of the history of the Septuagint. He was a Jewish philosopher who lived in the 2nd century BC, and we have fragments of his writings which exist in the early church fathers. One of those is preserved by Eusebius. It says, the entire translation of all the contents of our law was made in the time of the king surnamed Philadelphus, thy ancestor, who brought greater zeal to the work, which was managed by Demetrius Philarius. Okay, so here he's telling you that all the contents of our law were translated. So what is that? What is all the contents of our law? Well, as it turns out, he wasn't explicit, and it's up to interpretation. Okay, it wasn't clear that what he's referring to is the Pentateuch alone, but it is a strong language, right? All the contents of our law does seem to imply maybe this law was the wider sense of the term. This diversity of interpretation is acknowledged by Lancelot Brenton in his introduction to his translation of the Septuagint. He says different opinions have been formed as to what is intended by Aristobulus when he speaks of the law. Some consider that he refers merely to the Pentateuch, while others extend this signification to the Old Testament scriptures in general. The former opinion appears to be favored by the strict meaning of the terms used, the latter by the mode in which the Jews often applied the name of the law to the whole of their sacred writings. Okay, so he's acknowledging that there is a diversity of interpretations on this. Some people say, oh, this law refers to that tripartite division, only to the Pentateuch. Others are saying, no, this is the wider sense of the meaning. So my point here is just to simply put forward there are 2 different ways to interpret Aristobulus. He doesn't say the 5 books of Moses were translated. He says that all the contents of our law were translated. And now it's up to you to interpret what that means. So how about the letter of Aristeas? Well, like Aristobulus, the letter of Aristeas refers to the Septuagint's content as the law. Okay, so similar situation. It says in chapter 2, I, Eleazar, have sent them, that's the 72 translators, to you with a copy of our law. Okay, so that's the Hebrew scriptures that were being sent from Judea to Alexandria to be translated were the law. Okay, and it doesn't define exactly what books comprise that law. And then in chapter 7, it says they entered with the gifts which had been sent with them and the valuable parchments on which the law was inscribed with gold in Jewish characters. Now that the law is the Septuagint, but again, doesn't define exactly what comprises that law. Now throughout this letter, it refers to the Septuagint or its Hebrew originals as documents the divine law, the Jewish books, books of the law, but it never defines these books or law as being only the books of Moses. So there is some interpretive wiggle room here. We know that law could go in different directions depending on the context, and it's never explicitly defined what exactly comprises the books of the law in this letter. Now, even if we were to grant that law means the Pentateuch, the letter itself implies that other books were translated. And this is a fascinating point that I've never heard anyone mention. They seem to gloss over this when they're reading this letter. So in the letter, Demetrius is writing to King Ptolemy, suggesting him to start the Septuagint project. And he says the following. He says, Demetrius to the great king, since you have given me instructions, O king, that the books which are needed to complete your library should be collected together, and that those which are defective should be repaired, I have devoted myself with the utmost care to the fulfillment of your wishes, and I now have the following proposal to lay before you. The books of the law of Jews, with some others, are absent from the library. They are written in the Hebrew characters and language. It is necessary that these should be made accurate for your library. Now, what are these other books that are being requested by Demetrius? Well, whatever they are, they're not a part of the books of the law. They're in addition to those. So even if you were to define the law as the Pentateuch, you still have to deal with this source, which seems to imply that other books were being requested. And if you read the whole letter, you'll see at the end that Demetrius is very happy with the Septuagint that was produced. So the implication is that these other books did come to Alexandria to be translated. Now, what about Philo of Alexandria? He's another ancient Jewish source. Well, Philo recounts the origin of the origin story of the Septuagint in his book on the life of Moses, book number 2. And like all other Jewish sources, he says that the laws were translated, but he never defines those as the Pentateuch alone. So again, there's room for interpretation with Philo. Now, when telling the story of the Septuagint, he does set the context as the legislation of Moses, which does seem to imply the Pentateuch alone. He says, he, Ptolemy, then being a sovereign of this character and having conceived a great admiration for and love of the legislation of Moses, conceived the idea of having our laws translated into the Greek language. Now, you might look at this and say, well, legislation of Moses, laws, he must be talking about the Pentateuch. But does this quote say that these laws were only the legislation of Moses? No, he's only saying that the legislation of Moses caused Ptolemy to fall in love with the laws of the Jews. So you can easily interpret this as Ptolemy heard about Mosaic and Mosaic law, fell in love with that, and then invited the whole of the Jewish scriptures to be interpreted and translated by the 70 translators. So this does not prove anything. It can be interpreted either way. Now, the context of the book being on the life of Moses means that Philo was inclined to emphasize the Mosaic portions of Scripture a little bit. Okay, so it's not surprising that he's emphasizing the Mosaic legislation, because that's the whole topic of this book that he's writing in general. So there's that to consider as well. Now, what about Josephus? Josephus provides his most detailed statement on the contents of the Septuagint in his preface to his work Antiquities of the Jews. He writes the following: For even he, that's Ptolemy, failed to obtain all our records, and the word for records here is anagraphin. It was only the portion containing the law which was delivered to him by those who were sent to Alexandria to interpret it. The things narrated in the sacred scriptures are, however, innumerable, seeing that they embrace the history of 5,000 years and recount all sorts of surprising reverses, many fortunes of war, heroic exploits of generals, and political revolutions. Now, is this a gotcha quote? Because he says that only the portion containing the law was translated. So are these records, these anagraphine, the scriptures? And he's saying out of all the scriptures, only the law was translated? Well, he doesn't say that from all the scriptures, the Pentateuch was translated. That's never explicitly defined or stated in this quote. What he actually says is from all the records, only the law was translated. So if you look at the Greek, the word there is anagraphin, okay, and the word for law is noma, and BDAG lexicon defines anagrapho as readings, public records, records or registers. Now, are these the scriptures? Well, not necessarily, right? Public readings, public records. What are those? We don't really know exactly what Josephus had in mind when he was saying that, because we do know that the Jews had many more writings and books other than the scriptures. Many of these have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza. So the only books that the Jews had were not just the scriptures, right? They had lots of other books, which Josephus could be referring to as the records, the anagraphin. So we have the same problem as before. What do you mean the law, right? What do you mean anagraphin? What do you mean the law? Well, he doesn't exactly specify that. So there really are two interpretations from this quote. You could go with the contemporary modern interpretation that the law is the Pentateuch and the records are the other books of scripture. Or you can interpret the law as the scriptures, and the records are the entire sum of Jewish writings, including those which are non-biblical. So which one of these interpretations is the correct one? Well, according to Josephus, we'll never know because he doesn't specify, but both of these interpretations are absolutely possible. Now, in fact, in Josephus, there is internal evidence that the books of the law were not only the books of Moses. So Josephus interprets the books of laws requested by Demetrius as many works. He uses this word many to describe the number of books that were in this law. He says in Antiquities, book 12:14, he says Demetrius added that he had been informed that among the Jews also there were many works on their law, which were worthy of study and of a place in the king's library, but being written in the script and language of this people, they would be no small trouble to have them translated into the Greek tongue. Now, is 5 books many books? Is that many works? I don't know if I would describe 5 as many, right? So it doesn't say how many is many for Josephus, but the fact that he described it as many is a little bit suspicious and seems more consistent with the larger corpus interpretation than the smaller one. Okay, but at the end of the day, the point that I'm trying to make is that Josephus is up for interpretation. He never explicitly defines that law translated by the 70 translators as being the Pentateuch alone, never explicitly stated. But even if we were to grant that Josephus supports the Pentateuch alone view, he really is not the only interpretation on the block. We have other early witnesses interpreting this differently, and he's certainly not the earliest witnesses. The earliest would be Aristobulus and the Letter of Aristeas. Okay. It's also noteworthy that Josephus lived not much earlier than our earliest Christian witness of the Septuagint, Justin Martyr, who's virtually contemporary with Josephus. He was born only a few years after Josephus died, and he interprets the larger corpus of the Septuagint. So, speaking of early Christian writers, let's take a look at some of the early Christian witnesses. Now, this is one of those facts that just doesn't get mentioned a lot, but it's a huge elephant in the room. And this is the fact that, with the sole exception of St. Jerome, the historic Christian position and the unanimous position of the early church fathers was that the Septuagint translators translated most or all of the Old Testament. Now, that's a huge fact, and it's something that I think is enough to stop most Christians right in their tracks and to be a little bit hesitant to just take in without any question this statement that only the Pentateuch was translated. We have the whole witness of the early church and the church fathers and Christian tradition, which are saying that no, the bulk of the Old Testament was translated by the 70 translators. And this fact is acknowledged by Henry Sweet, the great Septuagint scholar. He says It has been stated that the Letter of Aristeas does not profess to describe the origin of any part of the Alexandrian Bible except the Pentateuch. Christian writers, however, failed to notice this limitation. The whole Greek Bible was familiarly known as the version of the 70, and no misgivings were felt upon the matter except by Jerome, whose intercourse with the rabbis had opened his eyes on this and other matters of which the Jews were better informed. Now, there's a lot here that is very, very interesting. Again, this is a modern scholar, a great Septuagint scholar who's familiar with all the sources, all the resources, and he's acknowledging that the Christians, with the exception of St. Jerome, believed that the whole Greek Bible was the version of the 70 translators. Now, it's also interesting that we know exactly why St. Jerome had a different opinion. That's because he was learning from the Jewish rabbis of his time. So the interpretation that the Septuagint, the original Septuagint, was only the Pentateuch, was a rabbinic Jewish teaching that St. Jerome had adopted in the 4th century. Okay, but the other Christians during his lifetime and before his lifetime had not had that interpretation. They had a different interpretation of a larger corpus for the Septuagint. Okay, now something important about the church fathers is they are not just witnesses to the Christian teaching, but they're also ancient witnesses to the history of the Septuagint in general. So they're not just good reflections of the Christian teaching, they're very, very early. Again, Justin Martyr is not much later than Josephus in his account, and Irenaeus is from a contemporary of Justin Martyr. So these are very early witnesses to the history of the Septuagint, and I think very important witnesses. Now, Justin Martyr is the earliest Christian witness we have to the story of the Septuagint. He writes the following. He says, "And when Ptolemy, king of Egypt, formed a library and endeavored to collect the writings of all men, he heard also of these prophets, and sent to Herod, who was at that time king of the Jews, requesting that the books of the prophets be sent to him. And Herod the king did indeed send them, written as they were, in the foresaid Hebrew language. And when their contents were found to be unintelligible to the Egyptians, he again sent and requested that men be commissioned to translate them into the Greek language. And when this was done, the books remained with the Egyptians where they are until now." Now, a few really interesting things. For one, according to St. Justin Martyr, what books were translated? He says the prophets. So, of course, that would include the Pentateuch because Moses was a prophet, but it would also include all the major prophets and minor prophets and probably the books of Samuel, maybe the books of Ezra. So this would have, in Psalms, by the way, David would have been considered a kind of a prophet. So all of these books, according to Justin Martyr, would have been translated by the 70. And it's also interesting that he reports the books still being in Alexandria up to his time. So he's not talking about a translation of the Bible that's long lost, but something that's still there, that's observable to people during his time. He says in his dialogue with Trypho, "But I am far from putting reliance in your teachers who refuse to admit that the interpretation made by the 70 elders who are with Ptolemy, king of the Egyptians, is a correct one, and they attempt to frame another. And I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations affected by those 70 elders who are with Ptolemy." Now, after he says this quote, he goes on to demonstrate variants from Isaiah, from Jeremiah, from the Psalms, all of these that he's taking as the translation of those 70 elders. Now, it's important to note that when he's doing this, he's writing to a Jew. Okay, so according to him, this Jew would have no problem acknowledging Isaiah and Jeremiah and the Psalms as being a part of the translation of the 70. He sort of takes that as a given. So we can assume that Trypho the Jew would have agreed with Justin and that all the prophets were translated by the 70. So Justin never makes the argument trying to defend that these books were translated by the 70. He just sort of agrees that he and the Jews he's writing to already believe this. I think that's very interesting. So Justin Martyr may not just be reflecting a Christian tradition, but also seems to be indicating it was a Jewish tradition as well, that these prophets and Psalms were a part of the translation of the 70. Now, Justin was born around AD 114, and Josephus died around 100, not many years before Justin Martyr was born. So he's not a much later resource. So people who would pit, Josephus against Justin Martyr, right, just consider the fact that they're not they're not far apart in time. And of course, Josephus is up to interpretation anyway. So let's continue. Saint Irenaeus, also a 2nd century church father, writes the following. He says, Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, being anxious to adorn the library which he had founded in Alexandria with a collection of the writings of all men which were works of merit, made request to the people of Jerusalem that they should have their scriptures translated into the Greek language. And they, at that time they were still subject to the Macedonians, sent to Ptolemy 70 of their elders, who were thoroughly skilled in the scriptures and in both the languages, to carry out what he had desired. So what did the 70 translators carry out? They carried out a translation of the scriptures according to St. Irenaeus. There's no indication at all that this is anything other than the bulk of the corpus of the Old Testament. Okay, there's no indication that this was the Pentateuch alone. So St. Irenaeus also seems to agree with Justin Martyr that more than the Pentateuch was being translated at that time. Clement of Alexandria, a late 2nd century, early 3rd century Christian writer, says the following. He says, It is said that the scriptures, both of the law and of the prophets, were translated from the dialect of the Hebrews into the Greek language in the reign of Ptolemy the son of Logos. Now, did you catch that? Explicit statement that the scriptures, both of the law and of the prophets, were translated by the 70 translators under Ptolemy. That's what Clement of Alexandria is telling us, okay? Now, Clement of Alexandria was the head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. So he wasn't a nobody. He was a highly educated Christian writer and teacher in Alexandria at that time. Now, Alexandria was where the Septuagint was produced. And according to Justin Martyr, it was still there. So Clement of Alexandria was the head of the Christian catechetical school in the city where the Septuagint was produced. And he's telling us that both the law and the prophets were translated under Ptolemy. So if anybody would know what the Septuagint was, it seems like it would be Clement of Alexandria. And again, he's not a late person. He's not a late father. He's not a medieval father, something like this. He's very, very close to the time of Josephus and the time of Philo, not far removed at all, very early Christian writer. Now, later in the chapter, he cites Aristobulus, which shows his familiarity with his work. So he would have been familiar with the account of the Septuagint from Aristobulus and would have interpreted that law as being more than just the Pentateuch. Tertullian, late 2nd, early 3rd century Christian writer, says the following. He says, Now in ancient times the people we call Jews bear the name of Hebrews, and so both their writings and their speech were in Hebrew, but that the understanding of their books might not be wanting, this also the Jews supplied to Ptolemy. For they gave him 72 interpreters, men of whom the philosopher Menedemus, the well-known asserter of a providence, regarded with respect as sharing in his views. The same account is given by Aristeas. So the king left these works unlocked to all in the Greek language. To this day, at the temple of Serapis, the libraries of Ptolemy are to be seen with the identical Hebrew originals in them. So again, the exact same message as the other Christian writers. The Septuagint is still in Alexandria at this time. It's still there. You can still go and see it. And it consists of the books of the Jews, the writings of the Jews. There's no indication here that it's just the Pentateuch, a small portion of it. Now, very importantly, the context of this chapter is the prophets. Before he says this story, he's talking about how the prophets' works were translated and made available in Greek so that all men can have knowledge of God. So the context here is the prophets making God known to men, and then he tells the story of the Septuagint, how it was translated. So obviously he's referring to here in their books, their writings, he's including the prophets like the other Christian writers. He also cites the letter of Aristeas explicitly, indicating that his interpretation of law includes the prophets, which is completely consistent with the New Testament usage of the language. Again, Paul is going to call Isaiah the law, right? So it's not strange at all that Tertullian would interpret the laws, including the prophets. St. Anatolius of Alexandria, a 3rd century Christian writer, he says Aristobulus was one of the 70 who translated the sacred and holy scriptures of the Hebrews for Ptolemy Philadelphus and his father, and dedicated his exegetical books on the law of Moses to the same kings. So, according to St. Anatolius, what books are translated? The sacred and holy scriptures of the Hebrews. It seems to be the whole Old Testament, according to his account. Now, early in the work, Anatolius references Philo and Josephus, indicating a familiarity with their works. And this is very important. I'm mentioning that because you heard maybe in the quote from Sweet that, oh, the Christians were just not as informed as the Jews. And I think that the references from these fathers themselves disproves that, because they're reading the same sources that the Jews are reading. They're getting this information from the same resources. They were informed. They were just interpreting the law differently than the rabbinic Jews were at the same time. Next is St. Theonas of Alexandria from the 3rd century. He says Philadelphus chose someone for this charge and appointed to the superintendence of his most noble library, I mean Aristeas, his confidential chamberlain, whom he sent also as his legate to Eleazar with most magnificent gifts in recognition of the translation of the sacred scriptures. And this person also wrote the full history of the 70 interpreters. On occasion, also, he will endeavor to laud the divine scriptures, which with marvelous care and most liberal expenditure Ptolemy Philadelphus caused to be translated into our language. So another account of the sacred scriptures, the divine scriptures being translated by the 70. And he's obviously familiar with the letter of Aristeas, so he's obviously interpreting law as including the broader corpus of Old Testament books. So two takeaways again is that he's interpreting that the Septuagint was comprised of the sacred scriptures in general. It wasn't just the Pentateuch. And he's also familiar with the letter of Aristeas, and he's interpreting this consistently with that view. St. Athanasius, a very important church father in church history, he says, however, the body which he wore for our sakes is a creature, concerning which Jeremiah says, according to the addition of the 70 translators, the Lord created for us for a planting a new salvation, in which salvation men shall go about. Now, Athanasius quotes from Jeremiah, and he calls this according to the addition of the 70 translators. So he's recognizing the book of Jeremiah as belonging to the 70 translators. So again, according to this father, very important father, who also was from Alexandria, by the way, he was interpreting the law or the Septuagint as including the books of the prophets. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, another important church father, he says, read the divine scriptures, the 22 books of the Old Testament, these that have been translated by the 72 interpreters. So he very explicitly states that the 22 books of the Hebrew Aramaic Old Testament were translated by the Septuagint translators. This would obviously include the bulk of the Old Testament. It would include all those Protestant books, probably include Baruch, Epistle, Jeremiah, probably a lot of other things in there as well from the Septuagint version, but 22 books is certainly much more than the Pentateuch. St. Epiphanius in the 4th century says the exact same message. He says, to every pair of translators, one book was given. That is to say, the book of the Genesis of the world to one pair, the Exodus of the Israelites to another pair, that of Leviticus to another, and the next book in order to the next, and thus were translated the 27 recognized canonical books, but 22 when counted according to the letters of the alphabet of the Hebrews. Now, earlier he defines those 22 books. They're the exact same books as St. Cyril of Jerusalem's list. So they're both interpreting the bulk of the Old Testament being translated by the 70 translators. It's also very interesting here that in Epiphanius' account, he's describing the Septuagint translators of breaking up the books into pairs. which, if that's the case, would explain why there is differences in translation style, because the whole committee is not translating each book individually. The books are being dispersed among the Judean translators. So that would certainly explain why there's differences in translation styles. Not every set of translators among the Judean translators were translating in the exact same way. St. John Chrysostom has a very interesting quote here on the Septuagint. He recounts the whole story of the formation of the Old Testament and indicates that the law of Moses, the prophets, and all the books compiled by Ezra were translated by the 70. He says, "But as it is, some do not even know that there are any scriptures, yet the Holy Spirit indeed made so many wise provisions in order that they might be safely kept. And look at it from the first, that ye may learn the unspeakable love of God. He inspired the blessed Moses. He engraved the tablets. He detained him on the mount 40 days, and again as many more to give the law. And after this he sent prophets, who suffered woes innumerable. War came on. They slew them all. They cut them to pieces. The books, that is, the books of the law and the prophets that they wrote, were burned. Again, he inspired another admirable man to publish them, Ezra, and caused them to be put together from the remains. And after this, he arranged that they should be translated by the 70. They did translate them. Christ came. He receives them. The apostles dispersed them among men. Christ wrought signs and wonders." So St. John Chrysostom is telling the history of the Old Testament. Moses received the law. Then the prophets came. They wrote books. Those books were added to the corpus of scriptures. And then those books were destroyed by wars. Then Ezra restored the scriptures, and then the scriptures were translated by the 70. And the important point for this discussion is that he interprets all of the books that were compiled by Ezra to be the translation, to have been translated by the 70 translators. St. Augustine writes, "Ptolemy begged Eleazar, who was the high priest, to give him the scriptures, which he had heard by report were truly divine, and therefore greatly desired to have in that most noble library he had made. When the high priest had sent them to him in Hebrew, he afterwards demanded interpreters of him, and there were given to him 72. Out of each of the 12 tribes, 6 men, most learned in both languages, to wit, the Hebrew and Greek, and their translation is now by custom called the Septuagint." So according to St. Augustine, the Septuagint is the scriptures. It's not just the Pentateuch, it's the whole scriptures. So in conclusion, in summary of these points, all of our earliest Jewish sources say that the Septuagint was a translation of the law, but they never defined the law as the Pentateuch alone. That's very important. That's a key point. It's just a fact. Again, don't shoot me, the messenger. I'm just reporting the simple fact. They never say the Pentateuch alone was translated. They just say the law was translated. The New Testament and Jewish tradition indicate that the law could refer to the Old Testament in general, and this seems to be the favored interpretation of the entire consensus of the early church, with the exception, of course, of St. Jerome, who was learning from rabbis. Rabbis, by the way, who rejected the Septuagint because it was being used for Christian prophecies. The Letter of Aristeas, Demetrius explicitly requested other books, for translation in addition to the books of the Jewish law. So even within the Letter of Aristeas, there's internal evidence that other books were being brought to be translated, not just the Pentateuch. Josephus reports that the law consisted of many books, which seems to be more consistent with a larger corpus than a smaller corpus of 5 books. The overwhelming patristic consensus, including some of our earliest historic witnesses like Justin Martyr, tell that the scriptures or the prophets were translated by the 70. And the fathers were educated and aware of the earlier Jewish accounts and interpreted them simply differently than the rabbinic Jews. And I'm talking about later Jews, not those Jews during Christ's time, but those Jews who are talking to St. Jerome and by modern scholars. So it's not a question of, who's more educated. Modern scholars tend to think that, the early churches wasn't as educated as the Jews. It's more a question of how do you interpret those early Jewish sources? Do you interpret them like the 4th and 5th century rabbinic Jews in the Talmud? Or do you interpret them like the early church fathers as being a larger corpus? So The early Jewish sources do not say explicitly, but we do have two interpretations up for consideration. I'm just putting those in front of you. You can do what you want with that information. I'm not telling you what to believe. I just want you to be aware of all the facts, that this is the church's historic teaching, and there's a good reason for it. The church fathers are not dummies. They are familiar with the ancient Jewish sources and just interpreted them slightly differently. So if you found this video interesting, hit that like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.